I'm really excited to be here, and it's trying to get choked up over that introduction and work myself into my more typical sort of furious anger about the state of education technology and technology, et cetera. So initially, I thought back in January, I was going to write or give a talk about why a domain of one's own matters. I was going to sing its praises. There was something about an event being postponed a couple of times and sort of like the weight of the internet piling on my shoulders. But I think what I'm going to talk about today is sort of rantier than my initial flowery praises for it. But truthfully, people ask me all the time. They say, like, what technologies have you seen that you like? You know, I feel like it's always a trick question. People know how I'm going to answer. They say, sort of, have you seen anything interesting? What in ed tech is innovative? And often I sigh and sort of shake my head. But I am on record, actually several times in several places, as saying that a domain of one's own is, I think, the most interesting and the most innovative initiative in ed tech right now. The responses I get to that are often pretty interesting. People are, some people, looks like you, are like, oh, hell yeah, Jim Groom rocks. And then I said, well, actually, it's Team Rocks. It's okay. But I get a lot of like, oh yeah, Jim Groom, great, awesome stuff. Most of the time I get people who say, what the hell is domain of one's own? If they're wise asses, they'll say, oh, is that a Seinfeld episode? Or they say, I don't know, I've never heard of it. Has EdSurge written about it? Or they'll say, I don't understand. Why is having a blog a big deal? Or, 20 years ago, the university gave me space on the university site, and I don't get why kids today blogging is innovative. So this question of innovation, right? So what is it about a domain of one's own that is innovative? What's special about it? Because it really isn't just a blog. It isn't simply /your username at your universities.edu. The initiative, I think, represents open learning, right? What it means to learn on the web. What does learning look like that is of the web? What does learning look like that is truly sort of with and of this new medium? And all along the way, I think the domain of one's own also offers a resistance, something we were sort of talking about earlier today, resistance to the silos of learning management systems, but also resistance to the silos of academic disciplines. I think it highlights the importance of learner agency, right, of learning in public, of control of your digital identity, and I think increasingly the importance of web-based literacy. Of course, I recognize that Domain of One's Own initiative does, in many, many ways, sort of fly in the face of the definition of the way in which the tech industry and the ed tech industry like to define and market innovation to us. Market to us as teachers and students, market to us as consumers, market to us as users, right? How we're supposed to think about technology development, how we're supposed to think about innovation, right? This is innovation. This is innovation. And of course, these aren't ed tech products, right? Google Glass and Google self-driving car have not yet been sort of pushed into the classroom. Unlike Google Apps for Education, Google Docs, Chromebooks, Android tablets, YouTube, what else? Google Reader, no, they killed that. Google Scholar, Hangouts, Helpouts, Google MOOCs, and so on and so on. I think we can probably debate, actually, whether or not a lot of these Google products that are being used in the classroom really are that innovative. I think that, sadly, that's one of the things we've actually come to expect about education technology. It's always sort of behind the times. We don't actually have very high expectations for innovation in ed tech. And I think unlike a lot of the technologies that are geared specifically towards classroom use, Google has never really suffered for paying attention to education. It's never really been tainted by the ways in which the institution is seen as sort of old hat. Actually, Google is seen as doing a great favor to schools by giving them these new cloud-based products for free. You could argue, I think, that Google does have some sort of education-oriented mission, right? To organize the world's information and to make it universally accessible and useful. But again, in undertaking this mission, Google doesn't really talk about innovation as being something that happens within education institutions, whether they're libraries or universities. You know, the company really positions itself and its products as being outside that. Like their positions itself as being sort of a tech, this is a tech innovation. This is a Silicon Valley innovation. It might be a Stanford innovation, but a Stanford innovation is closer to tech and to Silicon Valley than the rest of the measly institutions out there in the world. I mean, that's Google's tech. I think that you can argue, as Google has grown, the implications of its mission, right, the mission to organize the world's information, these implications are becoming more and more serious, right? These implications are political, they're economic, they're technological, they're scientific, they're cultural, and they're global. Google looks less and less like a library card catalog, if you will, one that helps us find the information that we're searching for on the web. That's particularly true in light of some of the companies that it's acquired recently. Military robots. A couple weeks ago, it acquired a drone company. A couple months ago, it acquired a company that does internet-connected thermostats and smoke alarms for your home. Now, no doubt, these are examples of Google helping to organize the world's information, helping to oftentimes using our information as it does so. And we're told this exchange, right? We're told this extraction of data is innovation. Google Glass and Google self-driving car are initiatives, interestingly enough, of what's called the company's Google X program. This is a special laboratory. Google prides itself as being an innovative company, but Google X is supposedly like the leading edge of innovation within Google. It's what Larry Page talks about as technology moonshots, right? This notion that we're doing even more, or that Google X is doing even more ambitious things than the rest of Google. This is how an article in Bloomberg Business Week described the lab, which, keep in mind this as you think about it. Google X seems to be an heir to the classic research labs, such as the Manhattan Project. Oh, cool. Which created the first atomic bomb, and Bletchley Park, where code breakers cracked German ciphers and gave birth to modern cryptography. Awesome. I'm stoked. Google believes in and enables us to do things that wouldn't be possible in academia, says Chris Urmson, a former assistant research professor at Carnegie Mellon, who's now the head of the self-driving car project, right? Things that wouldn't be possible in academia. Of course, perhaps that's because academia doesn't have the resources. Perhaps that's because that there's a focus, whether real or perceived, on theoretical rather than applied research in academia. Perhaps that's because there's certain elements of sort of a distaste or disgust about sort of overtly commercial endeavors. Perhaps because academia, some parts of academia, some departments, like to minimize or ignore the connections that they have to the development of war technologies. Certainly the computer industry today likes to do that. Perhaps because academia doesn't do a good job promoting its scholarship to the public, right? In organizing the world's information and actually making it accessible or useful, sadly. Perhaps because academia doesn't do a good job in hyping its achievements, right? But perhaps because today we're defining innovation as something that actually doesn't happen in universities. Innovation is being defined as something that happens in the industry. And innovation is being defined as something that happens in the private sector, not in the public sector. Much of what happens at Google X is actually secret, though. Among its other research projects that we do know of are Google contact lenses an experiment to see if tiny sensors on contact lenses will be a different way to monitor diabetics' glucose levels. There's Project Loon, an experiment to use high-altitude balloons to deliver internet to remote areas. And there's Google Brain, a vast computer simulation of the human brain that will be like neural networks connecting thousands of computers together. This is called deep learning. So a couple of the names of those who work at Google X, in addition to co-founder Sergey Brin, names we know now quite well in academia, Sebastian Thrun and Andrew Ng. Sebastian Thrun, one of the creators of the self-driving car. He also happens to be an artificial intelligence professor at Stanford. He also happens to be the founder of an online education startup. Andrew Ng, he also happens to be a Stanford artificial intelligence professor. He's one of the researchers on Google Brain. He also happens to be one of the co-founders of an online education startup. Now, I'm actually sort of disinclined to talk to you today about MOOCs because I feel like we've spent like the last 2 years really only talking about MOOCs. I really want to talk about the domain of one phone, and not even about Google. But I think that MOOCs are probably actually a subtext to much of what I've been thinking lately. There's certainly a subtext to much of this talk. I think it's important to think about Sebastian Thrun and Andrew Ng's work at Google X, how we define innovation, right? What are we thinking about when we talk about the relationship between Stanford and Google? What are the connections between a vision of the future of teaching and learning with technology that involves automation, that involves sort of vast data mining processes that Google is known for? Why do some people balk at the domain of one's own as being innovative and thinking that something like MOOCs, something like Coursera or Udacity are the latest and greatest and most amazing thing they've ever seen on the internet? And it is really interesting to me. I'm actually working on a book right now called Teaching Machines about the history of automation in education, to think about the role of artificial intelligence in sort of this particular vision of the future. It's fascinating to me that the people who have founded these MOOCs come from an artificial intelligence background. Thrun, Ng, Daphne Koller, his co-founder at Coursera, Anand Agrawal at edX. They all come from an artificial intelligence background. That's a particular way of thinking about learning, thinking about machines, thinking about artificial intelligence at scale, thinking about content delivery, thinking about machine learning, thinking about data at scale. So I think MOOCs are ideology. Google is ideology. And certainly scale is an important part of their ideology. Scale is really important in terms of the technologies that many of these companies like Google use. Scale is important to think about their global reach as well. It's important in terms of their economic impact. It's the way in which I think economic growth, particularly economic growth, is framed by venture capitalists. Scale is important when we talk about the breadth of these companies' offerings, particularly Google, which is hardly just a search engine company anymore, although it does remain, if you look at its quarterly reports, very much an advertising company. Scale is important when we think about the sectors that are being transformed by something like Google, by the technology sector, how these things work sort of practically as well as ideologically. Scale is important when we think about sort of all of the ways in which the world is being, as Siva Vayanathan talks about, sort of the Googleization of everything. Scale is important in the technology, how they actually function. Scale is a sort of part of the way in which the business world sort of explain this to us. It's the way that we frame any idea nowadays when we talk about a new idea or a new initiative. One of the first questions that people will ask you is, but does it scale? And I think when people ask, but does it scale, what they mean is actually, can we replicate this system across vast geographic areas, thanks to internet technology and probably some sort of proprietary software system, right? And maybe a shot of venture capital, right? What we mean is sort of like, is this idea the next Google? Our technological world sort of necessitates and demands thinking at scale, or at least sort of that's the message that we get from the tech and from the business sectors, right? Technological progress is necessary, sort of scale is necessary, progress demands it. And here again, I think it's important to think about the ways in which the domain of one's own does not scale, right? The domain of one's own sort of flies in the face of this message about scale. Doesn't fit the pattern. Now clearly we're seeing the domain of one's own move from University of Mary Washington to Emory, to Davidson College, to other regional areas, but it's not doing so in the sort of technological replication. It's doing it because we're building community. It's doing so because we're building capacity. We're not just bringing the code from one school to another and growing this technological effort. But this is a people effort. Unlike Google, right? Google scales through technology, right? This is how it works, through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of servers. This infrastructure that they have is immense. It's sort of mind-boggling to think about. Every time you type a word or a phrase into the search box in Google, between 700 and 1,000 computers immediately respond. They go through their web indexes and within 0.16 seconds have delivered you over 5 million responses. That is technology at sort of an amazing scale and complexity. And of course, now that Google is sort of much more than a search engine, that infrastructure is being used to process all sorts of data. And now, thanks to their terms of service change, all of the way in which we're using Google is connected. The way in which we email one another, the way in which we use Google Docs, the way in which we use YouTube, the way in which we use Maps, the way in which we use Google+, the way in which we perhaps spy on things with our Google glasses. Incredible amount of data that Google knows about us. We're actually all creating a mind-boggling amount of data, thanks to new technologies, in increasing volume, in increasing speed, with increasing complexity. In 2012, IBM said that we were creating 2.5 quintillion bytes of data a day. And that was 2 years ago. So you can just imagine that that number has completely skyrocketed. That's, of course, big data, right? Numbers that are too big to be added up in your Casio calculator, too big to be manipulated in a Google spreadsheet. And this is big data is the sort of thing that entrepreneurs and technocrats and technologists and government officials and venture capitalists and quants are completely stoked about, right? They think that this is going to, if we can capture this data and process this data and analyze this data, then we will have so much more innovation. More innovation in education, more innovation in education at scale. A lot of this data is actually created by sensors. There are actually more sensors in each American home than there are people. But devices actually like the Nest thermostat that Google just acquired. But a lot of this data is actually human created. Some of it's like user-generated content, what we think about as user-generated content, but it's also data that we aren't really aware of that we're creating. What's called data exhaust, the metadata that's a result of all of our interactions with these technologies. I think people are somewhat more aware of metadata now, thanks to the revelations of Edward Snowden, the former CIA agent who last summer, CIA analyst, who disclosed sort of vast surveillance efforts of the NSA. The collection of data from telephone technology companies, email, videos, photos, voice over IP chats, file transfers, social networking details, ciphering from Apple, from Google, from Facebook, from Microsoft, from Yahoo, from AOL, from World of Warcraft, from Angry Birds, all of the areas of sensitive government information. Encryption has been undermined. They've been spreading malware. Our social connections have been mapped. Warrantless spying by the governments, not just on suspected terrorists, but on all of us. Privacy researcher Chris Sagoyan actually joked on Twitter. He said, Google built the greatest surveillance system in the world. It's really not a surprise that the NSA wants to use it. So Google knows a lot about us, right? Google knows what we search for, what we email, who we email, when, where we are, where we live, where we're going, what we watch, what we write, what we read, what we buy. It mines this data purportedly to offer us better products and services, and of course, to sell ads. And here again is why a domain of one's own matters, why it runs counter to this dominant trend in technology today, particularly a growing trend in ed tech, where all of the data that our students are creating is being mined in order, of course, to personalize their education. A domain of one's own asks us to consider the infrastructure. It asks us to understand the web and our place on it. It asks us to pay attention to the content we create, to pay attention as teachers and as students. It asks us to think about where the data best resides, where our content best resides, who has access to it, and for how long. It prompts us to ask, my God, what kind of data are we creating as learners, and who owns it? Who tracks us, and who profits? As our worlds are becoming increasingly mediated by computer technologies, we are more and more being encouraged to hand over data of our lives. More data to Google, more data to all sorts of technology companies, and certainly in schools, all sorts of data to ed tech companies as well. And most of us think nothing about this. We agree to the terms of service without reading them. That means we often are handing over our data. We're giving up control over what's being done to it. We're acquiescing more and more of our privacy. And in doing so, I think we're assured that technology will give us access to better stuff, right? To more innovation. Arthur C. Clarke once famously said, of course, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And technology companies, they really benefit when we think that all of this is magic. Right? There is very little incentive for them to equip us with the skills to understand how the technology works, to have the critical capacity and the technical capacity to run our own servers, to build our own applications, to use and contribute to open source software, to claim our piece on the open web, ultimately really, to challenge their business models. Because let's be clear, I think for many companies, the business model is predicated on them profiting off of our content and our data. Again, a domain of one's own builds literacy so that the technology of the web is distinguishable from magic, right? So that those of us understand how to manipulate its symbols, and that those people who do so are not high priests or magicians, but they're actually all of us, right? That we can actually carve out and operate our own little piece of the web. And perhaps once we've done so for a while, have the confidence to build more and more and more upon it. Sort of explore more elements of technology's terrain, to feel empowered, I think, to resist this Googleization. And a quick aside about magic, since David brought this up earlier. Actually, I'm a folklorist by training, oddly enough. And I don't want to dismiss or belittle the idea of wonder. I do not want us to move into a world that is devoid of wonder, and a world that is only about technology. I don't want to reduce everything we do and think to this notion of user-generated content, or personal data, or code. How cold and empty those phrases sound, right? This idea that a love letter becomes a status update, right? That a love song is only useful for its metadata. that poetic expression just becomes like a transaction between an API and its endpoints. Right? I think we have convinced ourselves that we wrestled the internet away from some of these endeavors, right? That we were able to make the internet, and the web in particular, a place for poetic expression. But I think that we should be aware of the fact that I don't think that battle was won. Looking at the FCC announcements this week about net neutrality, it's pretty clear that this notion of the web as a free and utopian place where we can all be poets together is sort of, we're kidding ourselves to thinking that that's sort of going to be that way forever. I tend to be deeply pessimistic, actually, about the path that technology, particularly education technology, is taking. I'm a pessimist, as Antonio Gramsci said, because of intelligence, but an optimist because of will. I am a skeptic about a lot of ed tech because I am a critic of late capitalism. I am opposed to militarization. I'm not a fan of surveillance. I think that we have a lot to own up to with the relationships between imperialism and technology. And as a matter of fact, the role that education has probably played in that as well. But I do try. I do really try some days, sometimes, to be an optimist. I think those of us that work in education are, by necessity, that we can make the world a better place. That's why we work on this particular initiative. Gardner Campbell actually wrote last year, "It seems to me that educators, no matter how skeptical their views, and skepticism is necessary, are implicitly committed to optimism. Otherwise, why learn? Why teach?" And so yeah, I mean, we in education, we believe in ideas. Sure, we believe in knowledge. We believe as well that in critical contemplation and in intellectual reciprocity, we believe in wise and deliberate action. But I really think most of all, we're optimists because we believe in people. And as David alluded to earlier, I mean, I'm here because of people. I mean, sure, I'm here because I own my own domain, right? That I'm able to control my own voice on the internet, that I have a space where I can tell stories about education technology that are different than other people's stories about education technology. And for some odd reason, people seem to like that or find me mildly amusing on Twitter. But even before that, before www.hackeducation.com, before I bought www.audreywaters.com back 10 years ago when I was a grad student. And I decided to get a blog. I didn't start a blog to write about education technology. I started a blog because my husband was dying of cancer. And I was struggling to be a grad student and a mom and watch my partner die. And I was losing my shit. I still had to teach classes. I was supposed to write a dissertation. And instead, I wrote a blog. Whatever. Those were the early days. Those were the early days of academic blogging. Those were the days when Ivan Tribble, and those of you who've been around this long enough, still know the name Ivan Tribble, who bravely wrote under a pseudonym in the Chronicle of Higher Education that people that blogged would never get jobs. And so it was sort of a weird time to be a grad student online. But I found a great support network online. I found fellow grad students, junior faculty who really did support me in my darkest hour. I recognized at the time as well that the community that I had built online through my writing was actually much more powerful and cared about me a lot more deeply than did my own dissertation committee. That is a pretty stark realization for a grad student, but there you have it. You know, and that's, I think, what's magic about technology. Not that you can stick a little camera on someone's glasses and they can walk around and film people. Not that you can use all the data that you've sort of gathered by having the Google Maps project to make a car drive. It's not magic to have military robots that are going to kick our asses. What's magic is that we can use technology to connect at a really incredibly profoundly deep level with one another and care and support for one another. That's magical. The ability to connect with other people that you are separated from over physical space, that's wonderful. Of course, you know, internet companies, they love that story. I mean, that's the sort of stuff they put in their ads, right? Kids FaceTiming with their grandparents, astronauts in space singing Major Tom to us. That's amazing stuff. They love it when we get a little teary-eyed about the power of technology, right? But that desire for human connection, I think, and not that cold-term communication, I think that is our weak spot, right? That is where they so easily convince us that you can't possibly get rid of your iPhone. In fact, you should convince your mother and your grandmother to buy an iPhone so that you can all FaceTime in joyous splendor together. So they say, like, trust us, right? It just works. You don't have to know about the technology. You don't have to know what's happening to your data. We'll take care of it for you. Just use our products and please don't read the terms of service. Right? They're cool with that. But I think that actually probably that's what makes education susceptible to a lot of this as well. It's a moment of vulnerability. We care about students, and we sort of are like, yeah, you deal with the code, and we'll deal with the heart. But I would argue as well that this desire for connection is probably our strength as well. Because I think that we're going to grow a little tired of seeing ourselves, seeing our data, seeing our stories, seeing our students exploited, right? We will, and again, this is why I believe a domain of one's own is so important and so innovative. We will have to learn how to seize and build these tools and build something for ourselves. One path forward is perhaps, with a nod to Donna Haraway, this idea of cyborgs, right? The main trouble with cyborgs, she reminds us, is that they are the illegitimate offspring of militarism and patriarchal capitalism, not to mention state socialism. Illegitimate offspring are often exceedingly unfaithful to their origins. A domain of one's own is a cyborg tactic, right? It is kin to the learning management system. It is kin to Web 2.0, but it is pretty subversive to today's internet technologies, and particularly to today's educational technologies. Connected, again, as Haraway reminds us, to this idea of command, communication, control, intelligence. A cyborg tactic, an illegitimate offspring. You know, Jim Broom talks about this a lot. A domain of one's own is fiercely disloyal to the LMS. And I hope, eventually, fiercely disloyal to Google. A domain of one's own makes us think not just about our own domain, right? Our own space on the web, but it helps us to think about ways in which we might need to reclaim bits and pieces of our lives that have already been extracted from us. Beyond just the assignments that we do at school, to the photos that we take for a class assignment, to our personal photos, to the rest of our data. It prompts us to think about what our digital identity looks like, who controls it, who owns our data, who tracks it, who's making money from it, and it equips us to ask these questions. It equips us technologically, it equips us philosophically, it makes us think about sort of the political questions and the economic questions and the questions about ourselves and our communities, our practices, And I think it recognizes that we should be actors and not objects in control of our education. We should be actors and not objects of education technology in particular. So, I know it's corny, but I really love the May '68 phrase, beneath the cobblestones, the beach. Right, I know, it's like so cliche to invoke the situationists. I think if you're cool these days, you invoke Thomas Piketty, perhaps, but I don't think he actually has done much spray painting in Paris, maybe. But it's such a punk rock phrase, right? It's the idea that if we dig up the infrastructure of modern life, beneath that is actually something beautiful. And that if we dig up the infrastructure of modern life, what we find in our hands is actually a weapon. I love that, because that is how we resist Google. That is how we resist the technology industry. That is how we resist the education technology industry. That is how we resist the NSA. And that's why domain of one's own matters. That's why it is incredibly innovative and wickedly subversive about this whole idea of what tech innovation looks like and what ed tech innovation looks like, and who's an object framed by those things, and who's actually a powerful, powerful actor. Thank you.